Lyra didn't know that the servant who cleaned King Adrian's chambers was never supposed to see him. She didn't know that palace servants like her were meant to be invisible, working only when the royal wing lay empty. And she certainly didn't know that the man she glimpsed through the partially open door, the one with storm-grey eyes who looked directly at her, was the Alpha King himself. The mistake happened on a Tuesday morning when the dawn light barely touched the marble floors of the castle's east wing. Lyra had arrived early to finish her cleaning duties before the palace stirred to life. Her worn leather shoes made no sound against the polished stone as she pushed her cart of supplies down the endless corridor. She was nothing, less than nothing. An orphan girl with no family name, no connections, no reason for anyone to notice her existence. Her brown hair hung in a simple braid down her back, and her dress was a borrowed thing, too large in the shoulders and too short at the wrists. But it was clean, and it was hers for as long as she remained useful to the palace. The royal chambers stood at the end of the hall like a golden fortress. Lyra had cleaned them 100 times before, always when they were empty, always when King Adrian was away on royal business or holding court in the throne room. Today should have been no different. She knocked softly, as protocol demanded. No answer. She knocked again. Silence. The door opened beneath her gentle push, revealing the most beautiful room she had ever seen. Sunlight poured through tall windows, casting everything in warm amber. Rich tapestries covered the walls, and a massive bed dominated one side of the space, its dark blue coverlets rumpled as if someone had recently risen. Lyra stepped inside, pulling her cart behind her. She began with the windows, as always, using careful strokes to remove any dust from the glass. The view looked out over the kingdom's heart, where she could see people beginning their morning routines in the distance. She was reaching for the highest corner of the window when she heard it. A voice, deep and rough with sleep. "Who are you?" Her blood went cold. The cloth fell from her trembling fingers as she spun around, and there he was. The man stood in the doorway to what must have been his private bathing chamber, steam still curling around his broad shoulders. Dark hair, slightly damp. Skin that seemed to glow with health and strength. And those eyes, storm-grey eyes that looked at her with an intensity that stole her breath. Something in her chest pulled tight, something warm and golden and impossible. She stammered, dropping into a curtsy so deep her knees nearly touched the floor. "Your Majesty, I'm so sorry. I thought you were in court. I'll leave immediately. Please forgive me." But when she raised her eyes, he was staring at her with a strange expression. Not anger, as she had expected. Something else. Something that made that warm feeling in her chest spread through her entire body like honey. "I asked who you are," he said again, his voice softer now. He took a step toward her, and she noticed he was barefoot, wearing only dark trousers and a loose white shirt that hung open at the throat. "Nobody, Your Majesty," she whispered. "I'm nobody at all." The words seemed to affect him strangely. His eyes narrowed, and he took another step closer. "Nobody?" he repeated, and there was something almost dangerous in the way he said it. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs. She had never been this close to a man like him, had never felt anything like the strange pull in her chest, as if something inside her was reaching toward him against her will. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lyra, Your Majesty." "Lyra?" He said it like he was tasting something sweet. "How long have you worked in the palace?" 3 years, Your Majesty, since I was 15. She couldn't understand why he was asking these questions, why he wasn't dismissing her or calling for the guards. He was close enough now that she could smell him, something clean and masculine like cedar and rain. The golden warmth in her chest intensified, and she had the strangest urge to step closer instead of backing away. 3 years, he murmured, and I've never seen you before. "I work early, Your Majesty. Before you're usually awake. I'm supposed to be invisible." Something flickered across his features. "Invisible," he repeated, and his voice held a note she couldn't identify, almost like anger but not directed at her. A knock on the door shattered the moment. "Your Majesty," came a voice from the hallway, "your morning meetings are ready to begin." The spell broke. Lyra remembered where she was, what she was doing here. She grabbed her fallen cloth and stumbled toward her cart. "I have to go," she whispered. "I'm sorry, so sorry." But as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Lyra." She turned back, unable to help herself. His storm-grey eyes held hers for one more impossible moment. "I'll see you again." It wasn't a question. It was a promise. Lyra fled. She didn't stop running until she reached the servants' quarters, deep in the bowels of the castle. Her small room was barely large enough for a bed and a washstand, but it was hers, and it was safe. She pressed her back against the door and tried to catch her breath. What had just happened? The warmth in her chest hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger, like a golden thread connecting her to something she couldn't name. She pressed her hand against her sternum, feeling her heart race beneath her palm. King Adrian. She had looked the Alpha King in the eyes and lived to tell about it. More than that, he had spoken to her, asked her name, promised to see her again. But that was impossible. Kings didn't notice servants. They certainly didn't notice orphan girls who wore borrowed dresses and cleaned chambers in the early morning hours. She must have imagined it. The intensity in his gaze, the way he had said her name, the strange pull she had felt. It was all in her head. A foolish girl's fantasy about a man so far above her station that they might as well live in different worlds. A knock on her door made her jump. "Lyra," came a voice she recognised. "Are you in there?" She opened the door to find Mrs. Henley, the head of housekeeping, standing in the narrow hallway with a concerned expression. "There you are," the older woman said. "I was looking for you. There's been an announcement." Lyra's stomach dropped. "An announcement?" "About the King's parade. It's next week and all hands are needed for preparations. You'll be working on decorations along the parade route." The King's parade. The annual celebration where King Adrian walked among his people, showing himself to the kingdom. Lyra had heard of it, of course, but she had never participated. Servants like her didn't attend public celebrations. "Along the parade route," she repeated faintly. "Yes, outside the castle walls with the rest of the staff. It's an honour, really. Not everyone gets chosen for public duties." An honour, or a punishment for being seen where she shouldn't have been. "Will the king be there?" Lyra asked, then immediately wished she hadn't. "Mrs." Henley gave her a strange look. "Of course he'll be there. It's his parade. Why do you ask?" "No reason," Lyra said quickly. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow morning, early, and Lyra?" Mrs. Henley's voice grew stern. "Remember your place. We're there to work, not to gawk. The king doesn't notice servants, and that's how it should be." Lyra nodded, not trusting her voice. The king doesn't notice servants. But as Mrs. Henley walked away, Lyra touched her chest again, feeling that golden warmth pulse beneath her fingers. Something told her that everything Mrs. Henley had just said was wrong. King Adrian had noticed her. And despite every logical thought in her head, despite 3 years of learning to be invisible, despite the fact that it was dangerous and foolish and impossible, she wanted him to notice her again. The thought terrified her almost as much as it thrilled her. She closed her door and leaned against it, pressing both hands to her chest. Whatever was happening to her, whatever this strange pull meant, she had 1 week to figure it out. 1 week until the King's parade. 1 week until she would have to choose between remaining safely invisible and letting herself be seen. The golden thread in Lyra's chest grew stronger with each passing day. 3 days after her encounter with King Adrian, she woke to find the warm sensation pulsing like a second heartbeat beneath her ribs. It pulled at her constantly now, tugging her toward the royal wing whenever she walked the castle corridors. She found herself taking longer routes to her duties, hoping for another glimpse of storm-grey eyes that haunted her dreams. But the king was nowhere to be found. "He's in meetings with the council," she overheard one of the senior maids saying as they prepared linens. Parade preparations have him busy from dawn to dusk. Lyra's hand stilled on the sheet she was folding. Even hearing his title spoken aloud made that impossible warmth flare in her chest. "I heard he's still unmated," whispered another maid, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Can you imagine? The most powerful alpha in the kingdom, and no queen beside him." "He's been searching for years," the first maid replied. "They say he'll know his true mate the moment he sees her, that the bond will claim them both." Lyra's breath caught. The bond, the golden thread that had appeared the instant she met the king's eyes. Could it be what the maids were describing? Impossible. She was nobody. A servant girl with no bloodline, no wolf, no claim to anything beyond the borrowed dress on her back. "What does it feel like?" she found herself asking before she could stop the words. Both maids turned to stare at her. Lyra rarely spoke during their shared duties, preferring to remain as invisible in conversation as she was in the castle halls. "What does what feel like, dear?" asked the older woman, Mrs. Carver. The mating bond, when it happens." Mrs. Carver's expression softened. "I've heard it described as a golden thread that connects soul to soul, a warmth that never leaves you once you've found your other half. They say it starts as a pull, like something in your chest reaching toward home." Lyra's hand flew to her sternum. Something in your chest reaching toward home. "But that's just stories," the younger maid said with a laugh. "Romantic nonsense for kitchen girls to sigh over. Real mating bonds are for real wolves, not servants like us." The words hit Lyra like cold water. Of course, she had been letting her imagination run away with her, weaving fantasies around a moment that meant nothing. The king had simply been surprised to find someone in his chambers, nothing more. But that night she dreamed of storm-grey eyes and woke with the golden thread burning so bright in her chest that she gasped aloud. The next morning brought parade preparation assignments. Lyra found herself standing in the castle's great courtyard with dozens of other servants, all clutching lists of duties and looking overwhelmed by the scope of the celebration ahead. "The royal procession will begin at the castle gates and wind through the main square before returning," announced Master Coleman, the chief steward. "Decorations must be perfect. This parade celebrates not just our king, but our kingdom's prosperity and strength." Lyra was assigned to floral arrangements along the parade route's first section. The work required her to leave the castle grounds entirely, something she had rarely done in her 3 years of service. Standing on the cobblestone streets outside the castle walls, she felt exposed and vulnerable. People bustled around her, merchants preparing special displays, citizens claiming viewing spots, children running between the adults with excitement sparkling in their eyes. The scale of the celebration overwhelmed her. Thousands would gather to watch King Adrian pass. Thousands of people all pressed together in the streets, all focused on one man. The thought made her stomach churn with anxiety. "First time on parade duty?" asked a voice beside her. Lyra turned to find Willem, one of the stable boys, carrying an armload of ribbon for the decorations. "Yes," she admitted, "it's bigger than I expected." Willem laughed. "Wait until you see the crowd on parade day. People come from across the kingdom to catch a glimpse of the king. It gets so packed you can barely breathe." Barely breathe. Lyra's hands began to shake as she imagined being trapped in a sea of bodies, unable to move or escape. "Are you all right?" Willem asked, noticing her pale complexion. "I don't like crowds," she whispered. "Then you'll want to stay well back when the procession passes. Find a spot near a side street so you can duck away if it gets too overwhelming." Lyra nodded, grateful for the advice. But even as she agreed, the golden thread in her chest pulsed with something that felt almost like disagreement. She spent the afternoon hanging garlands and arranging flowers, trying to focus on the work instead of the growing dread in her stomach. But every few minutes the warm sensation beneath her ribs would flare, and she would find herself scanning the castle walls as if expecting to see a familiar figure watching from the towers. As the sun began to set, painting the cobblestones in shades of amber and rose, Lyra felt the pull in her chest intensify suddenly. She straightened from the flower arrangement she was adjusting and turned toward the castle. There, standing on a high balcony that overlooked the parade route, was King Adrian. Even at this distance, even surrounded by advisers and guards, she would have known those broad shoulders anywhere. He stood with perfect stillness, surveying the preparations below with an expression she couldn't read from so far away. The golden thread blazed to life, tugging at her so powerfully that she actually took a step toward the castle before catching herself. As if sensing her attention, King Adrian's head turned. His gaze swept the crowd of workers below, moving slowly, deliberately until it found her. Their eyes met across the distance, and Lyra's world narrowed to that single point of connection. The noise of the street faded. The people around her ceased to exist. There was only the king's storm-grey stare and the impossible warmth flooding her entire body. He was too far away for her to see his expression clearly, but something in his posture changed. He stepped closer to the balcony's edge, his hands gripping the stone railing. "Lyra!" Willem's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "We need to finish these arrangements before dark." She tore her gaze away from the balcony and found Willem standing beside a half-completed flower display, looking confused by her distraction. When she looked back up, the balcony was empty. But the golden thread continued to burn in her chest, brighter than ever. That evening, back in her small room, Lyra sat on her narrow bed and pressed both hands to her heart. The warmth hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger throughout the day, until she felt as if she carried a small sun beneath her ribs. She thought about the maid's conversation, about bonds and mates and golden threads that connected souls. She thought about the way King Adrian had looked at her, both in his chambers and from the balcony, the intensity in his gaze that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced. And she thought about tomorrow's parade, when thousands of people would crowd the streets and the king would pass within mere feet of where she stood. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to hide, to stay in the castle during the procession, safe in the kitchens or the servants' quarters where she belonged. Crowds terrified her, being seen terrified her, and the thought of being lost among all those people made her chest tight with panic. But the golden thread had other ideas. It pulled at her relentlessly, a constant reminder of storm-grey eyes and a deep voice saying her name like a prayer. It whispered impossible possibilities and made her heart race with something that felt dangerously like hope. Lyra lay back on her pillow and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow she would have to choose. She could remain hidden and safe, invisible as she had always been, protected from the crushing weight of the crowd and the impossible dream that a king might notice a servant. Or she could let herself be pulled forward by this golden madness in her chest. She could find a spot along the parade route and watch for those storm-grey eyes, even though everything rational in her mind insisted it was foolish beyond words. The warmth pulsed beneath her hands, steady and insistent. For the first time in her life, Lyra found herself choosing hope over fear. Tomorrow, she decided, she would let herself be seen. Parade day dawned with golden sunlight and a city electric with anticipation. Lyra stood at her small window, watching the kingdom come alive below. Even from the servants' quarters, she could hear the excitement building. Merchants calling out their wares, children laughing, the distant sound of musicians tuning their instruments for the procession. The golden thread in her chest hummed with nervous energy. She had barely slept, her mind spinning between terror and anticipation. A dozen times during the night she had changed her mind about attending the parade. A dozen times the warm pull beneath her ribs had convinced her otherwise. Now, as she braided her hair with trembling fingers, there was no turning back. Mrs. Henley found her in the kitchens an hour before the procession was set to begin. "Lyra, dear, you look pale. Are you feeling well?" Just nervous about the crowds, Lyra admitted, accepting the cup of tea the older woman offered. You don't have to watch, you know, Mrs. Henley said gently. Your duties are finished. You could stay inside until it's over. The suggestion was tempting, so tempting that Lyra almost nodded her agreement, but the golden thread pulsed insistently, and she found herself shaking her head instead. I want to see, she whispered. Mrs. Henley studied her with knowing eyes. First time seeing the king in a proper procession? Lyra nodded, not trusting her voice. He's magnificent, the older woman said softly, every inch a king. But remember, child, men like that exist in a different world than ours. Don't let yourself dream impossible dreams. Too late, Lyra thought as warmth bloomed in her chest. Far too late for that. The streets were already crowded when Lyra made her way to the parade route. She had hoped to find a quiet spot near the edge of the gathering, somewhere she could watch without feeling trapped. But thousands of people had claimed every available space, pressing together in a sea of eager faces and festival clothes. The noise was overwhelming. Conversations blended into a constant hum of voices, punctuated by bursts of laughter and children's excited shouts. The smell of too many bodies pressed close together made her stomach turn. Already she could feel panic creeping up her throat. Willem found her standing frozen near the edge of the crowd, her face white with anxiety. "There you are," he said cheerfully. "I saved you a spot up front, perfect view of the king when he passes." "Up front?" Lyra's voice came out strangled. "In the middle of all these people?" "Come on," Willem said, grabbing her hand before she could protest. "You'll never see anything from back here." He pulled her forward into the crowd, and Lyra's worst fears materialized. Bodies pressed against her from all sides. Elbows jabbed into her ribs. Someone's shoulder blocked her view entirely. The noise became deafening. She tried to pull back, but the crowd had closed behind her like water. There was nowhere to go. "Willem!" she gasped. But he had moved further ahead, calling back something she couldn't hear over the roar of voices. Panic bloomed full force in her chest. She was trapped. Completely and utterly trapped in a sea of strangers, with no way out and no escape route in sight. That was when the trumpet sounded. A hush fell over the crowd for just a moment before erupting into cheers so loud they seemed to shake the very stones beneath Lyra's feet. In the distance she could see the golden standards of the royal procession appearing around the corner. Despite her terror, despite the crushing weight of bodies around her, the golden thread in her chest blazed to life with such intensity that she gasped aloud. He was coming. The procession moved with majestic slowness down the main avenue. First came the royal guards in gleaming armour, their horses stepping in perfect synchronization. Then the nobles and advisers, dressed in their finest court attire. Musicians followed, their instruments creating a triumphant melody that seemed to lift the very air. And then, riding at the centre of it all on a magnificent black stallion, came King Adrian. Even from a distance, even through the pressing crowd, Lyra's breath caught in her throat. He wore ceremonial armour that seemed to capture and reflect the sunlight, making him appear almost otherworldly. His dark hair caught the breeze, and he sat his horse with the natural authority of a man born to rule. He was devastating, beautiful and powerful, and so far above her station that looking at him felt like staring directly into the sun. The golden thread pulled so hard she actually stumbled forward a step. The crowd surged around her as people strained to get closer, to catch a better glimpse of their king. Lyra found herself pushed and jostled, carried forward by the tide of bodies whether she wanted to move or not. And then, impossible as it seemed, King Adrian's gaze began to sweep the crowd. Lyra watched in fascination as his storm-grey eyes moved slowly, deliberately, across the sea of faces. He was looking for something, or someone. Their eyes met across the impossible distance, and Lyra's world exploded into golden fire. The connection slammed into her like lightning, so powerful that she actually cried out. Every person between them might as well have ceased to exist. There was only Adrian's intense stare and the bond roaring to life in her chest with a force that stole her breath. She saw his entire body change the moment he spotted her. His posture straightened, his hands tightened on the reins. His horse seemed to sense the shift in his rider and pranced nervously beneath him. Adrian leaned forward in his saddle, his gaze locked on hers with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see straight through to her soul. "Found you," his eyes seemed to say. "Finally found you." The moment stretched between them, golden and impossible and perfect, and then terror crashed over Lyra like a cold wave. This couldn't be happening. A king didn't look at a servant that way. A king didn't stop an entire parade to stare at a nobody in borrowed clothes. People were starting to notice the direction of his gaze. Whispers rippled through the crowd around her. Every instinct she had ever developed screamed at her to run. So she did. Lyra tore her gaze away from Adrian's and pushed frantically into the crowd. She had to get away, had to disappear before anyone else noticed what was happening, before the impossible moment stretched too far and shattered both their lives. "Excuse me," she gasped, shoving between bodies that seemed solid as walls. "Please, I need to get through." But the crowd was a living thing with its own momentum, and it carried her deeper instead of letting her escape. She pushed harder, panic lending strength to her small frame, but only succeeded in getting more thoroughly lost. The noise was unbearable now. Thousands of voices raised in celebration, all blending together into a roar that seemed to press against her skull. Someone stepped on her foot. Someone else's elbow caught her in the ribs so hard she stumbled. She couldn't breathe. The crowd was too thick, too tight, crushing her from all sides. Her vision started to tunnel, black spots dancing at the edges. "Please," she whispered, but her voice was lost in the chaos. She was drowning in a sea of bodies, and no one even noticed she was there. Desperately, she pushed in what she hoped was the direction of a side street, any escape route that might lead her away from this nightmare. But every direction looked the same. Endless faces, endless noise, endless pressure from all sides. The golden thread that had felt so warm and right just moments before now felt like a chain around her heart, connecting her to something impossible and dangerous and completely beyond her reach. She had been a fool to think she could be anything more than invisible, a fool to believe that golden warmth meant anything real, a fool to choose hope over the safety of shadows. As the crowd pressed tighter around her and the noise reached a crescendo that made her head pound, Lyra closed her eyes and tried to remember how to breathe. She was lost, completely, utterly lost in a sea of celebration that felt more like drowning. And somewhere behind her she could swear she heard the sound of horse hooves moving faster than a ceremonial pace should allow. The impossible happened in the space of a heartbeat. One moment, King Adrian was riding in stately procession through his kingdom, acknowledging the cheers of his people with the practised grace of a monarch. The next, his entire world narrowed to a single face in the crowd. Her, the servant girl from his chambers, Lyra, the one who had haunted his dreams for days, whose absence from his sight had felt like a physical ache. When their eyes met across the sea of faces, the bond slammed into him with the force of a lightning strike. Everything he had been searching for, everything he had hoped to find for centuries. There she was, looking at him with those wide, startled eyes, his mate, his queen, his everything. And then she ran. Adrian watched in growing alarm as Lyra pushed frantically into the crowd, her face pale with terror. She was trying to escape, trying to disappear back into the anonymity that had hidden her from him for 3 long years. Unacceptable. Without conscious thought, Adrian raised his hand high in the air. The gesture was one every person in his kingdom knew, the signal for absolute silence and stillness. The effect was instantaneous and stunning. Thousands of voices fell silent in a wave that spread outward from his position like ripples on a pond. The musicians stopped mid-note, children stopped running. Even the horses seemed to sense the gravity of the moment and stood perfectly still. In the span of 3 heartbeats, the entire kingdom had gone silent. Adrian's voice carried clearly across the hushed crowd. "Someone precious has been lost in this gathering. No one moves until she is found and brought to me safely." A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. People exchanged bewildered glances, uncertain what was happening. The king had stopped his own parade for someone lost in the crowd? "Your Majesty," one of his advisers ventured, riding closer. "Perhaps we could continue the procession and—" "No." Adrian's tone brooked no argument. His gaze swept the crowd with predatory intensity. "Find her, now!" Deep in the press of bodies, Lyra heard the commotion, but couldn't understand it. The sudden silence felt almost more overwhelming than the noise had been. Whispers rippled around her as people tried to make sense of what was happening. Did he say someone was lost? The king stopped the parade. Who could be important enough for that? Lyra pressed herself against someone's shoulder, trying to make herself even smaller. Whatever was happening, she wanted no part of it. She just needed to find a way out of this crush of people and back to the safety of the castle. "You there?" A firm voice cut through her panic. "Miss." A palace guard had appeared beside her, his trained eyes scanning the crowd methodically. When his gaze fell on Lyra, pale, trembling, clearly distressed, his expression sharpened with recognition. "You're the one," he said quietly. "The king is looking for you." Lyra's blood went cold. "No," she whispered. "There's been a mistake. I'm nobody, just a servant." The guard's expression gentled, but his grip on her arm was inescapable. "The king doesn't make mistakes about matters like this. Come along, miss, carefully now." As if by magic, the crowd parted before them. People stepped aside in hushed confusion, creating a clear path toward the front of the gathering. Lyra found herself being led forward through the sea of faces, every eye watching her passage with fascination and bewilderment. She had never been so visible in her entire life. The walk felt like an eternity and an instant all at once. With each step she could see King Adrian more clearly. He sat his horse with perfect stillness, but she could sense the coiled tension in his posture, the way his hands gripped the reins. His storm-grey eyes never left her face. When she finally reached the front of the crowd, standing in the open space between the people and their king, the silence became absolute. Thousands of people held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Adrian dismounted in one fluid motion, handing his reins to a nearby guard without taking his eyes off Lyra. When he stepped toward her, she automatically dropped into the deepest curtsy she could manage, her entire body trembling. "Your Majesty," she whispered. "I'm sorry, so sorry. I didn't mean to disrupt anything. Look at me." The command was gentle but unmistakable. Slowly, Lyra raised her eyes to meet his. The bond roared to life between them, visible to anyone with the sensitivity to see such things. Golden light seemed to shimmer in the air around them, and several people in the crowd gasped in recognition. Adrian stepped closer, close enough that only she could hear his next words. "There you are," he said softly. "I've been looking for you my whole life." "There's been a mistake," Lyra stammered, her voice breaking. "I'm nobody, Your Majesty. I'm nothing." Something dangerous flashed in Adrian's eyes. He reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle despite the power in his frame. "Wrong?" His voice carried now, projecting across the silent crowd so that his next words reached every ear in the gathering. "You think there's been a mistake?" His thumb brushed away a tear she didn't know had fallen. "You're not nothing, Lyra. You're everything." The crowd erupted in whispers and gasps. The king knew her name. He was touching her with reverent care. The bond between them was visible to anyone with eyes to see. But Adrian wasn't finished. Still holding her gaze, he turned slightly so that his voice would carry to every corner of the gathering. "Behold your future queen," he declared, his words ringing with absolute authority. "I have found my mate." The response was instantaneous. Cheers erupted from the crowd, growing louder and more enthusiastic as the realization sank in. Their king had found his queen. The bond they had all been hoping he would find had finally manifested, but Lyra could only stare at him in shock. Queen? Her? "This is impossible," she whispered. Adrian's hands were still framing her face, anchoring her to this moment that felt too huge and too bright to be real. "The bond doesn't lie," he said quietly. "What you've been feeling, that golden warmth in your chest, it's real. We're real." She could feel it now, blazing like a star beneath her ribs. The connection between them was so strong it was almost visible, a golden thread that bound soul to soul. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words barely audible. "I know." His voice was infinitely patient, infinitely kind. "But I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you." He stepped back just enough to meet her eyes fully, though his hands remained gentle on her face. "Will you come with me?" he asked, "not because you must, but because you choose to." The crowd held its breath. The kingdom waited, and Lyra found herself standing at the centre of the most important choice of her life. She could say no. She could ask to return to her servants' quarters, to her invisible life, to the safety of being nobody. Adrian would let her go. She could see that in his eyes. He would honour her choice, even if it broke his heart. But the golden thread in her chest sang with recognition and rightness. For the first time in her life, someone was asking her to choose her own destiny instead of simply accepting what fate handed her. And for the first time in her life, she chose hope over fear. "Yes," she whispered. The single word seemed to light Adrian from within. His smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. Without breaking eye contact, he reached for her hand. "Then let's go home," he said. In one smooth motion, he lifted her onto his horse, settling her in front of him and wrapping his ceremonial cloak around her shoulders. She fit against him perfectly, as if she had been made for this exact moment. The crowd's cheers became deafening as Adrian remounted behind her, one arm circling her waist to keep her secure. But all Lyra could focus on was the warmth of his body against her back and the way the golden thread in her chest had finally found its home. The parade continued, but now it was a celebration of more than the kingdom's prosperity. It was a celebration of love found, of destiny fulfilled, of a servant girl who had become a queen simply by being brave enough to let herself be seen. As they rode through the cheering streets, Adrian's voice was warm against her ear. "No more hiding," he murmured. "No more believing you're nothing. You're mine now, and I'm yours, forever." Lyra leaned back against his strength and let herself believe it was true. The days that followed were a whirlwind of impossible changes. Lyra woke on her first morning as Adrian's acknowledged mate in a room that was larger than the entire servants' quarters. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, hung with silk curtains the colour of deep sapphires. The bed beneath her was so soft she felt as if she were floating on clouds. For a moment she lay perfectly still, wondering if she had dreamed it all. But then the golden thread in her chest pulsed warm and steady, and she knew with absolute certainty that everything had changed forever. A soft knock at the door made her sit up quickly, pulling the covers to her chin. "Come in," she called hesitantly. To her surprise, it was Adrian who entered, carrying a silver tray laden with what smelled like the most delicious food she had ever encountered. He was dressed simply in dark trousers and a white shirt, his hair slightly mussed as if he too had just woken. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm with something that might have been relief. "I thought you might be hungry." Lyra stared at him in bewilderment. "You brought me breakfast?" "I wanted to see you," he admitted, setting the tray on the small table near the window. To make sure you were real, that yesterday wasn't some beautiful dream. The vulnerability in his voice made something in her chest flutter. Here was the most powerful man in the kingdom, confessing that he needed reassurance just as much as she did. It was real, she whispered. Yes, he said, moving closer, but stopping a careful distance from the bed. It was, but that doesn't mean you have to feel trapped by it. This room connects to mine, but the door locks from your side. You set the pace for everything that happens between us. The thoughtfulness of the gesture nearly undid her. She had expected demands, expectations, the overwhelming rush of royal protocol. Instead, Adrian was offering her choice and time and the space to find her footing. "I don't know how to be a queen," she confessed. Adrian's smile was gentle. "Then it's fortunate that I don't need you to be one right away. I need you to be Lyra, the woman brave enough to look a king in the eyes, the one who chose hope over fear." Over the following weeks, Adrian proved as patient as his words promised. He courted her with a tenderness that took her breath away, quiet conversations over shared meals, walks through the castle gardens where he listened to her thoughts about everything from the treatment of servants to the kingdom's agricultural policies. "You have insights I never considered," he told her one evening as they sat by the fire in his private study. "You've lived among the people I serve. You understand their needs in ways I'm only beginning to grasp." Lyra curled deeper into the chair he had provided for her, marvelling at how natural it felt to be here with him. "I was nobody for so long. I watched everything but participated in nothing." "You were never nobody," Adrian said firmly. "You were waiting. We both were." The conversations revealed the depth of loneliness they had both carried. Adrian spoke of centuries of searching, of the hollow ache that had lived in his chest until the moment he saw her. Lyra shared her fears of worthlessness, her belief that she had been invisible because she deserved to be. "Show me," Adrian said one night when she confessed how isolated she had felt. "Show you what?" "Where you lived, how you spent your days. I want to understand every part of your life before me." So Lyra led him through the castle's lower levels, showing him the servants' quarters with their narrow rooms and shared spaces. She took him to the kitchens, where she had eaten leftover meals and listened to gossip. She showed him the hidden staircases servants used to move unseen through the castle. Adrian's face grew darker with each revelation. 3 years, he said quietly. "You lived like this for 3 years and I never knew." "I wasn't supposed to be known," Lyra pointed out. "That was the whole point." "Not any more." His voice held a note of steel. "Never again." Within a week, Adrian had implemented changes throughout the castle. Servants' quarters were expanded and improved. Meals became communal affairs with better food and proper seating. A fund was established for education and advancement among the staff. "You're changing the entire kingdom," Lyra observed, watching him work late into the night on new policies. "You're changing me," he replied, pulling her into his arms. "Everything looks different through your eyes." The physical bond between them deepened gradually, naturally. Adrian never pushed, never demanded more than she was ready to give. Instead, he let their connection build through gentle touches, his hand on her back as they walked, her fingers brushing his as they reached for the same book, the way she had begun falling asleep against his shoulder during their evening conversations. 1 month after the parade, he found her in the castle's library, curled in a reading chair with a book of poetry. The sight of her there, completely at ease in what had become their shared space, made his heart clench with happiness. "Lyra!" She looked up, smiling at the sound of her name in his voice. "What is it?" Adrian knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "I love you." The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound and absolutely true. Lyra felt them sink into her bones, healing something she hadn't even known was broken. "I love you too," she whispered, and meant it with every fibre of her being. When he kissed her, Soft and reverent and full of promise, the golden thread between them blazed so bright it seemed to light the entire room. Later that evening, Adrian led her to the same balcony where he had first spotted her in the crowd below. The view looked out over the kingdom they would rule together, lights twinkling like earthbound stars. "I have something to ask you," he said, his voice carefully formal. Lyra turned to face him and found him holding a ring that took her breath away. It was simple and elegant, the stone catching moonlight like captured fire. "I already declared you my queen before the kingdom," he said, echoing words she remembered from that overwhelming day. "But I want you to choose me again, every day for the rest of our lives. Lyra, will you marry me?" The proposal was a formality. They were already bonded, already claimed in the eyes of both the kingdom and their own hearts. But it was also a choice, freely offered and freely made. "Yes," she said, just as she had in front of thousands of witnesses. Always yes. As Adrian slipped the ring onto her finger, Lyra marvelled at the journey that had brought her here. From invisible servant to beloved queen, from believing herself worthless to understanding that she was precious beyond measure. The golden thread in her chest hummed with contentment, and for the first time in her life, Lyra truly understood what it meant to be home. 6 months later, Queen Lyra stood on the castle's highest balcony, watching the sun rise over her kingdom. Her kingdom. Even now the words felt like a dream. The morning light painted everything in shades of gold and rose, and from this height she could see the changes that had transformed not just her life, but the lives of countless others. New housing for castle staff dotted the grounds below. The marketplace buzzed with expanded trade from policies she had helped shape. Gardens she had designed brought beauty to spaces that had once been purely functional. "Admiring your handiwork?" Adrian's voice was warm with affection as he joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Lyra leaned back against his chest, marvelling as she always did at how perfectly she fit against him. "I was thinking about how different everything looks from up here." "Different how?" "I used to see the kingdom from below, looking up. Now I see it from above, but somehow I understand it better." She turned in his arms to face him. "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense." Adrian's fingers traced the crown that now rested naturally on her head, as much a part of her as breathing. "You bring both perspectives to everything we do. It's why the people love you." It was true. In the months since their wedding, a celebration that had lasted 3 days and drawn visitors from across the realm, Lyra had found her place not just as Adrian's mate, but as a queen the kingdom had never expected to need. Her first royal decree had established education programs for servant children. Her second had created a council of common citizens to advise on matters affecting daily life. She had visited every village in the kingdom, listening to concerns and carrying solutions back to the castle. "The delegation from the Northern Territories arrives today," Adrian reminded her, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "I know. Are you nervous?" "Should I be?" Lyra smiled. "Only if you're worried about your wife charming them into agreeing to everything we want." Adrian's answering laugh rumbled through his chest. That stopped being a worry and became a certainty months ago. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their kingdom wake up around them. It was a ritual they had begun shortly after their wedding. These quiet moments before the day's responsibilities claimed them, when they could simply be Adrian and Lyra rather than king and queen. "Do you ever miss it?" Adrian asked suddenly. "Miss what?" "Being invisible, having no responsibilities beyond your own survival." Lyra considered the question seriously. There had been a simplicity to her old life, a safety in being overlooked. But there had also been a loneliness so deep she hadn't fully understood it until it was gone. "I miss the quiet sometimes," she admitted, "but I never want to be invisible again. Not when being seen means I can help people the way you helped me." "We helped each other," Adrian corrected gently. "I was lost until I found you." "And I was nothing until you showed me I was everything." They had had variations of this conversation many times, each of them still amazed by the transformation their bond had wrought. Adrian had become more connected to his people, more aware of their daily struggles. Lyra had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed, and a voice that could command attention and respect. "Your Majesty?" A soft voice interrupted their moment. One of the newer ladies-in-waiting, a former kitchen maid Lyra had promoted, stood in the doorway with an apologetic expression. "Yes, Clara. The children from the orphanage have arrived for their visit. They're very excited to see you." Lyra's face lit up. The monthly visits from the local orphanage had become one of her favourite royal duties, a chance to connect with children who reminded her of her younger self. "Of course, tell them I'll be there shortly." Clara curtsied and disappeared, leaving Adrian and Lyra alone again. "Go," Adrian said, reading the eagerness in her expression. "I'll handle the morning meetings. We can review the Northern delegation's proposals together this afternoon." "Are you sure?" "Lyra." He cupped her face in his hands, the gesture as natural now as breathing. 6 months ago you thought you had to ask permission to exist. Now you're checking if it's all right to do work that brings you joy and helps our people. Go to the children." She stood on her toes to kiss him, quick and sweet and full of the love that had only grown stronger with time. "I'll see you at lunch. I'll be the one trying not to fall asleep in council meetings while thinking about my beautiful wife." Lyra's laughter followed her as she hurried through the castle halls, her steps light with purpose. The orphanage children were waiting in the garden she had had specially designed for their visits. Lower walls they could climb safely, fruit trees they could pick from, flowers in every colour imaginable. "Your Majesty!" 20 young voices called out in unison as she appeared, followed by the thunder of small feet running toward her. Lyra opened her arms and let herself be engulfed by enthusiastic hugs, her heart swelling with the kind of joy she had never imagined possible. These children saw her not as a former servant who had gotten impossibly lucky, but as their queen who remembered what it felt like to have nothing and chose to use her position to ensure they would have everything. "What shall we do today?" she asked, settling on the grass despite her fine dress. "I have the whole morning free." "Tell us the story," called out Mira, a 7-year-old with bright red hair, "about how you and the king found each other." It had become their favourite tale, this story of a servant girl and a king who stopped an entire parade to find her. Lyra never tired of telling it, marvelling each time at how impossible it sounded and how beautifully true it was. "Very well," she said, gathering the children close. "Once upon a time there was a girl who thought she was invisible." As she spoke, weaving the familiar tale of golden threads and storm-grey eyes, Lyra caught sight of Adrian, watching from his study window high above. He raised his hand in a small wave, and she felt the bond between them pulse with warmth and contentment. The story reached its crescendo, the moment when the king declared before his entire kingdom that a nobody was his everything, and the children cheered as if hearing it for the first time. "And they lived happily ever after?" prompted little Thomas. "They lived," Lyra corrected gently, "joyfully ever after, because happiness is just a feeling, but joy is a choice you make every single day." That evening, as the Northern delegation departed with agreements that would benefit both kingdoms, Adrian found Lyra in their private chambers, brushing her long hair by the fire. She had changed from her formal gown into a simple nightdress, looking more like the servant girl he had first glimpsed in his chambers than the queen she had become. But there was a confidence in her posture now, a certainty in her movements that spoke of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. "Successful day?" he asked, settling beside her. "The best kind. The children loved their visit. The delegation agreed to our trade proposals, and I get to end it here with you." Adrian took the brush from her hands, working it gently through her hair as she leaned back against him. "I have something for you. It's not my birthday. It's the anniversary of the day I first saw you." Lyra turned to look at him in surprise. "You remember the exact date?" I remember everything about that morning, the way the sunlight caught in your hair, how you dropped your cloth when I spoke to you, the moment I knew my search was over." He handed her a small wrapped package, watching with tender eyes as she opened it carefully. Inside was a golden locket, delicately wrought and warm to the touch. When she opened it, she gasped. On one side was a tiny painting of the moment from the parade when their eyes had met across the crowd. On the other was an inscription in Adrian's careful script. "You are everything." "Adrian," she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "I never want you to forget," he said seriously. "On the difficult days, when the crown feels heavy or the decisions seem impossible, I want you to remember that you were chosen, not just by me, but by fate itself." Lyra turned fully in his arms, the locket clutched against her heart. "I love you," she said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she spoke them. "And I love you, my queen, my mate, my everything." When he kissed her, slow and deep and full of promise, the golden thread that had first drawn them together blazed with the light of a love that would endure for centuries to come. Outside their window, the kingdom slept peacefully under the protection of a king who had found his heart, and a queen who had discovered that being truly seen was the greatest gift of all.